Who could be so cruel as to brutally murder smitten young couples on their late-night dates? It seems like something else only seen in the movies. This is a deep dive into one of the most notorious unsolved homicide cases in Texas history, dubbed the Texarkana Phantom Killer. They took 5 innocent lives and have yet to be brought to justice even 76 years later. In 1946, the town of Texarkana was jolted by a string of cruel attacks in less than just 3 months. At the end of the spree, 3 people have been severely injured and 5 victims were shot dead. In each incident, the assailant fled the scene in just enough time, earning him the name the Phantom Killer. The small southern town of Texarkana was sent into a state of mayhem and panic. 76 years later, no one has ever been convicted of the attacks, leaving the victims and their loved ones with no justice.
On February 22, 1946, close to midnight, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and 19-year-old Mary Jean Larry had just finished watching a movie together on a double date at the local drive-in cinema. They dropped off their friends, and then the two drove to Lover's Lane. Jimmy parked the car, and they were both enjoying a calm, romantic evening. At one point, Jimmy exited the car to get a closer look at the stars above, while Mary stayed in the car. Suddenly, a bright flashlight blinded Jimmy's view. The man holding the flashlight ordered Jimmy to take his pants off while threatening him with a pistol. Jimmy claimed he must have had the wrong guy, to which the man told him he didn't want to kill him, but he needed to take his pants off. After Jimmy removed his pants, the man bashed Jimmy's head in with either a lead pipe or the pistol he'd been carrying. Jimmy fell to the ground and the man repeatedly kicked him and stomped on his chest. Meanwhile, Mary was unsure of what to do as she sat in the car, terrified. She reported that she remembered hearing a sudden cracking noise. Later she learned that had been the sound of Jimmy's skull cracking against the man's boot. Mary exited the car, dug in Jimmy's pocket to find his wallet, and asked the man to take whatever money was inside it. The man suddenly struck Mary in the head and she fell to the ground. Still conscious, Mary heard the man scream in her ear, "Run!" Somehow, she was able to get to her feet, and in her dress and heels, she booked it up the road. As she ran, she peeked behind her and watched as the man continued to beat Jimmy mercilessly. However, he stopped and ran towards her again. After he had caught up to her, he crushed her skull in with the weapon. The man then removed her underwear and sexually assaulted her with the barrel of the pistol that he just threatened to kill them with. Mary begged the man to just kill her. Instead, the man quickly fled into the night like a phantom. Mary fought hard. She picked up her bloodied, brutalized body and ran to the nearest home for help. Meanwhile, Jimmy was regaining consciousness next to their parked car and was surprisingly able to crawl to the main road. Oddly enough, an old couple stopped but refused to allow his bloody body in their car, so they told him they'd drive to get help. However, Mary had already gotten help, and the ambulance rescued him on the road. After being questioned by investigators, Mary and Jimmy gave 2 very different descriptions of the suspect. Both of them said the man was very large and wore a burlap sack over his head, with eye and mouth holes cut out. However, Mary claimed the man's voice sounded as if he was black, but Jimmy claimed he sounded like a young white man less than 30 years old. These descriptions weren't of any help.
Investigators and townsfolk initially believed this could have been a robbery that turned cruel and gruesome. But this was only the beginning of the horror they would face.
Just a month after Jimmy and Mary were assaulted, the Phantom attacked again. On March 23rd, 29-year-old Richard Griffin and 17-year-old Polly Moore were also enjoying their romantic night of intimacy. The two had also just finished a movie, went to a local cafe until nearly 2 a.m. and then parked Richard's car in Lover's Lane. Just as before, a masked man approached the car and pointed a gun at the couple through the window. He ordered Richard to remove his pants and then shot him twice in the back of the head. Either the man forced Polly out of the car or she attempted to run, but he shot her twice in the head on top of a blanket outside of the car that was later found soaked in blood. The assailant then picked up Polly's body and staged her back in the car next to Richard. Their bodies were found the following morning by a passing motorist who thought the passengers in the 1941 Oldsmobile were sleeping. Investigators were able to determine that the gun was a .32 automatic pistol and connected this case to the first attacks. However, this was the only evidence they had. The Phantom Killer would strike again the following month.
Was this slayer only targeting couples just enjoying each other's company? If so, what did he have against them? And will we ever find out?
On the evening of April 13, 1946, 16-year-old Paul Martin picked up his girlfriend Betty Jo Booker, who was 15 years old. Even at her young age, Betty lived a busy life. She had amazing grades. She was a dancer, she belonged to a sorority, and she played the saxophone with a local band called His Rhythmares. She and Paul Martin had known each other since kindergarten and had been friends ever since. Paul was also a well-liked guy who was described as being a sweet kid with no enemies. The two planned to watch a midnight movie, but Betty's weekly Rhythmares gig ran a little late. Paul didn't care though. He picked her up around 2 a.m. at the VFW in his 1946 Ford. Since they weren't able to watch the movie as they planned, they decided to grab a bite to eat and then just hang around town, maybe stopping by a friend's sleepover party later. But before they could do anything, Betty requested they stop at her house to drop off her saxophone. She hated being responsible for it and lugging it around places, as it was expensive and her prized possession. According to her friends, she would drop it off after every gig she played before doing anything else. However, Paul must have convinced her to just make a quick pit stop at Spring Lake Park in Texarkana just before they went to her house. The two pulled in and parked their car. As she sat, a car pulled up next to them. A man got out, walked over to Paul's side of the car, and pointed a gun at him through the window. The next morning, before 6 a.m., a couple stumbled upon Paul's body on the edge of North Park Road, lying on his left side. He'd been shot 4 times. The police searched for his car and found it about a mile away at the park, keys still in it. Initially, they weren't aware Betty was with him. After friends and family told them they were together the night before, they searched for Betty. She was found 6 hours later, 2 miles from the park. Her body was propped and staged against a tree, her coat was buttoned up to her chin, and her hand was in a pocket. She had been shot twice, and it was clear she'd also been sexually assaulted. Her saxophone wasn't in Paul's car, but would be found 6 months later, not far from the location of her body.
The Texarkana Phantom seems to be escalating, taking his victims' bodies and moving them to different areas, and after 3 separate attacks on couples, it's beginning to look a lot like a horror film.
The police determined the gun used to shoot Paul and Betty was also the .32 caliber gun used to murder Richard and Polly. The town went into complete hysteria at this point. Random young couples were being murdered while just enjoying their romantic date nights, and the suspect left behind little evidence and seemed to just disappear. The Texas Rangers attempted to lure the killer to Lover's Lane by disguising themselves as young couples in an unmarked car. However, he never showed up. Roadblocks were put in place and locals were being questioned one after another in an attempt to find any sort of clues. They came up empty each time though. Residents purchased guns to use as protection. Couples were no longer taking their nightly cruises, and a curfew was put in place. The entire town was so on edge that if neighbors entered their homes unannounced, as was common in 1946, homeowners would immediately point their loaded guns at them without thinking twice. Window shades, locks, and other security measures quickly disappeared from local stores. It was as if Texarkana was preparing for war.
And this was war. However, now that the town stopped with their date nights, They assumed the terror would end, but since they weren't coming out anymore, the killer had to make his way in.
On Friday, May 3rd, Virgil Starks and his wife, Katie Starks, both 36 years old, were relaxing in their small farmhouse on their 500 acres of land. They lived 10 miles northeast of Texarkana in Miller County, Arkansas. The two didn't have any children of their own, but they had plenty of nieces and nephews and cared for them deeply. This evening, the married couple wasn't worried about the crazed killer on the loose. They were well into their 30s and were sitting quietly in their home. They weren't spontaneous teenagers parked in Lover's Lane in the early morning hours. The last thing they expected was a serial rapist and murderer to destroy their lives. Virgil was sitting in his chair with a heating pad up against his back, relaxing. He calmed himself for the evening by listening to the news on the radio and reading the newspaper. His wife, Katie, was lying in bed, ready to fall asleep when she heard movement in their yard. Curious, she asked Virgil to turn the radio down. Suddenly, a man pointing a .32 automatic gun appeared at the window and shot Virgil in the back of the head as he sat in his chair. Katie ran to the living room, not knowing what just happened. She immediately saw her bloodied husband slumped over in his chair, and so she ran to the hand-crank phone. But before she could dial, the perpetrator shot her twice in the head. One shot went into her cheek, and the other into her mandible. Her teeth exploded out onto the floor. Surprisingly and miraculously, Katie survived. But she knew she needed to play dead, so she laid on the floor until she felt it was safe enough to get up. She was able to get to her feet, run across the highway, and into her nearby sister and brother-in-law's home, all while profusely bleeding, half-blind and in her nightgown. Neither her sister or brother-in-law were home, but a neighbor overheard her screams and came out of his house to help. The neighbor then fired his rifle into the air to alert the rest of the neighbors, which was pre-planned if the phantom killer had been spotted in the area, or if they needed immediate assistance. Neighbors poured from their homes and rushed Katie to the hospital. Earlier in the evening, state troopers noticed an unknown car parked outside of their home. They found it strange as they knew the Starks very well, but were too busy with their tasks at hand to stop and check it out. When they drove past later, the car was gone. Other than spotting the car, which the police just reported as an older model black car, there were no clues for them to act on. The town again was in a complete frenzy. Now the killer was shooting through windows and entering homes. Security systems and gun sales skyrocketed. Many guard dogs were purchased, and people were boarding up their windows at night. Even businesses were now required to close before sundown, along with the curfew previously put in place. Every resource was pulled into the case. Authorities from neighboring jurisdictions were patrolling the town, and the FBI was brought in to assist. Over 400 people were detained or arrested in connection with the case.
The Phantom Killer seems to be living up to his name quite well. He's an expert at covering his tracks and vanishing into the night. But will he finally be stopped? There were a lot of suspects, and while their stories were eyebrow-raising, they were all eventually cleared by authorities. I shall include two of the more interesting ones before getting to what is believed to be the most likely culprit.
Henry Booker Tennyson, also known by his nickname Doody, was an 18-year-old mischievous college student who decided to voluntarily depart the living via mercuric cyanide poisoning. But not before leaving behind riddles that would lead police to a hidden note confessing to the murders of Booker, Martin, and Starks.
Why did I take my own life? Well, when you committed 2 double murders, you would too. Yes, I did kill Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin in the city park that night, and killed Mr. Starks and tried to get Mrs. Starks. You wouldn't have guessed it. I did it when Mother was either out or asleep, and no one saw me do it. For the guns, I disassembled them and discarded them in different places.
Quite a confession, but one the police would ultimately deem to be nothing more than a tall tale. His own brothers agreed that Henry liked to tell stories, and the other notes found alongside the supposed confession give insights into Henry's troubled state of mind. He felt like a burden to his family and unfortunately saw no other way out. None of the fingerprints found at the crime scenes matched any of Henry's, and on the night of the Starks murder, a childhood friend of Henry's confirmed they had been together playing games. Despite this, Henry's own first cousin, once removed, Dr. John Tennyson, wrote a lengthy and detailed analysis, asserting that the case against the college students was much stronger than any other suspects. You can find it at diddudydoit.com. It's definitely worth a read. During the time Betty Jo Booker's saxophone was missing, police found a lead in Corpus Christi, Texas, where a man was trying to sell a saxophone to a music store. When confronted by the store manager, the man became nervous and ran away. Police were called, descriptions given, and he was arrested several days later. No saxophone was found in his possession, though suspiciously he did have a bag of bloody clothing in his hotel room, which he claimed was the result of a recent bar fight. Despite this, after extensive interrogation, he was cleared of suspicion.
This man has been completely eliminated. He has been checked and double-checked, and he couldn't have had anything to do with the murder cases here,
said Captain Gonzalez. As previously mentioned, the saxophone would be found months later not far from the crime scene, and its condition indicated that it hadn't been touched since that event. Despite the earlier described frenzy going on amongst the residents, it seemed the investigation was going nowhere. That was until one officer named Max Tackett noticed a curious coincidence. Shortly before each murder had been committed, a vehicle was stolen from the area. It just so happened that the one stolen on the night of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore's murders had turned up in a parking lot months later. The officer decided to stake it out together with his partner Tillman Johnson to see who would return. But to their surprise, the person who came to the car was just an innocent-looking young woman. Peggy Louise Swinney, formerly Stevens, was arrested and interrogated many times, divulging details of the circumstances around the murders that were allegedly not publicized in the media, such as the location of Paul Martin's address book, which was found in the same spot Peggy alleged Ewell had changed from his blood-covered clothes. 29-year-old Ewell Swinney was arrested for car theft. His wife, Peggy, confessed in great detail that her husband was the Phantom Killer. When Agent Hallett went to search the Swinney residence, he found a shirt having a laundry mark bearing the name of Starks. It would seem the detectives had their phantom. But Peggy's story kept changing after several interviews, and it would seem she was adding details that could be traced to what was publicized in the local press. She was deemed an unreliable witness, eventually recanting her whole confession, and couldn't be compelled to testify against her husband due to spousal privilege. Whatever she had said convinced the Texarkana Sheriff's Office and Texas Rangers that her story was untrue, due to being extensively questioned by Arkansas authorities. Prosecution no longer having the option to rely on their star witness, the murder charges against Ewell were dropped as the case would have to rely on mostly circumstantial evidence. This, however, was not a happy ending for Ewell. Being a repeat offender, he was still sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would spend 26 years in prison before successfully appealing his conviction, and continued to deny his involvement in the murders up until his death in 1994. Ewell is still widely considered the most likely suspect, especially since the murders stopped after he was in custody.
The town at Dreaded Sundown seems to be tolerable of sundown today. Instead of turning away from fear, they've completely steered into it and made it into a tradition. Some teenagers parked at Lover's Lane are probably still telling the horror story some 76 years later, threatening the return of the Phantom Killer. We, however, have told the story of the still unsolved Lake Bowden murders that you should check out in this video right here.